What's up, Cougar Nation, and welcome again aboard the Hype Train podcast. I am your host, Joe Wheat. That's at Joey27 on Twitter. As always, with my boys, Hunter Miller and Trevor Levitt, here to answer the burning question that has been on every BYU fan's minds. Is Taysom Hill a top 10 NFL player in BYU history?
You've picked an incredible time to ask that question, considering Hunter's hamstrung by his child at the moment.
It's exactly why it's the right time to answer. Legitimately, I have never I feel bad because I legitimately was seeing red during this debate. I have since mellowed out, but that might have seriously been a tipping point in our podcast history. Like it was almost the end of us. So if we can survive this, we can survive anything.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll have to get his take, but essentially to provide the listeners with context here, maybe this can be something that they can respond to the account with later on in the week. But is Taysom Hill a top 10 career-wise top 10 all-time BYU player in the pros? That's the question we've been grappling with the last couple of weeks. So if anybody has any thoughts on that, go ahead and tag us and let us know what you think. And maybe just give us what you think your list would be 1 through 10. Because I'd be interested to see. I think there's been some great cases made for both. I've been watching Joe in one corner and Hunter in the other. Lovingly, but competitively debate each other on this topic.
So I'm trying to. Okay, so here is the proposed list. Number 1, Steve Young. Number 2, Kyle Van Noy. Number 3, Fred Warner. Number 4, Todd Christensen. Number 5, Bart Oates. Number 6, Jim McMahon. Number 7, Chad Lewis. Number 8, Vi Sikahema. Number 9, Lee Johnson. And number 10, Puka Nacua. Which, fantastic list. The fact that there's 10 BYU players at all, and Puka Nacua, who is the number 1 receiver in the NFL according to PFF, is 10th on that list. Again, that's a great list. But what was surprising was Taysom Hill's omission from the list. To which I ask you, Trevor, is Taysom Hill a top 10 NFL player in BYU history?
Listen, I tend to think so. But I think Hunter makes some good points. And like when he gets on here, he's feeding, he's helping feed his daughter at the moment, being the great dad that he is. But
cue the smashing glass.
He's back.
I did not. I cannot see nor hear him. So
not again.
We're throwing it back to 2 weeks ago already. Oh, there he is. We got you.
Okay. All right. Good. I said cue the smashing glass. Stone Cold intro.
Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da.
Let me tell you this.
That was John Cena. I know that was John Cena, but still.
Yeah, same wrestler. Am I undervaluing Taysom Hill a smidgen? Probably yes. However, if you are looking at the totality of careers and eliminating recency bias, and I love BYU fans and all of our listeners, if you remove the fact that BYU fans only really watch BYU, and you broaden the horizon of NFL football and what it means to have an impactful NFL career, I don't see how you could put Taysom Hill above anyone on that list. Joe, I know Vi was kind of the one in the text exchange that you pointed to most and said better than Vi Sikahema. Vi Sikahema is one of only like 3 BYU football players to ever be an All-Pro. Like that means you are the best player at your position for an entire season in the NFL. He was, Devin Hester before Devin Hester. He was the ultimate special teams weapon in an era of NFL football where that really was, even probably more impactful than it is now. So that is my case for Vi Sikahema. We've obviously gone back and forth about it a lot, but
which again, I'm glad we're having this discussion now. I totally appreciate that argument. Like the way that you formulated the list based off of Pro Bowls, All Pro,
Years as a starter.
yours as a starter. Like those
Bart,
are all
Bart Oates was
great.
another one.
Like
where people listening are like, Bart Oates. And then you're like,
admittedly,
Bart Oates was an 11-year starter at his position, like started every single game for 11 consecutive seasons. Like that in the NFL is for 99% of people, is as successful of a career as you could ever ask for.
Which all respect to Bart Oates, he probably ended his NFL career before my parents got married. So it's difficult. I feel like I unfairly maligned the career of Bart Oates when I had no idea who he was. Candidly,
165 games started,
which for an offensive lineman is absolutely
insane.
Fantastic.
Yep.
The thing I keep going back to with Taysom Hill is the Honey Badger quote.
I would just want to throw out Bart Oates also missed a Super Bowl by 1 year. He retired the year before Steve Young and the Niners won the Super Bowl, so he would have also been a 12-year starter and Super Bowl champion had he not retired.
Fair enough. I keep going back to the Honey Badger quote from earlier this season when he was I think he was talking on a podcast, and he was saying like, oh yeah, people tell me all the time, bro, you're the best football player I've ever played with. And he goes, that's only because you haven't played with Taysom Hill. Like when the Honey Badger is saying that the best football player he has ever played with in his career, which involves an illustrious both college and pro career, is Taysom Hill. It's hard for me to overlook that when, in terms of just pure vibes and fame, he is probably the most recognizable BYU football player of the last. I mean, Zach Wilson was obviously visible. Puka's visible. Fred Warner's visible, but like
so fourth most visible in the last 2 years.
Which is fine, but he's had a much more visible career than most of the guys on that list, and he's also scored 50 touchdowns in his career. And he's like, they're putting up, like, every time he plays and touches the football, they're putting up Tungsten Armo Doyle ass tweets or like stats. Okay, like things that haven't been done since Jim Thorpe was playing. Taysom Hill is doing, like, he's just the ultimate throwback player, and like it. One way people describe the Hall of Fame is like, can you tell the story of your league without this person? If the answer is no, then you have to put him in the Hall of Fame. Taysom Hill, I feel like, is that for BYU. Like, if you tell the story of BYU players in the NFL, I feel like Taysom Hill has to be in that story, no?
Yes, but that I also don't believe at the first point.
Because
there's players that are in the NFL that you can tell the story of the NFL without saying their name, and yet they're a Hall of Fame player. And, could you tell the story of the NFL without mentioning Michael Vick? Like, probably not. He kind of revolutionized the way the quarterback position is played. Does that mean Michael Vick is a better quarterback than half the guys in the NFL Hall of Fame? Also, no. Right? So,
I mean, Michael Vick growing up was my favorite player, so I would tend to think he should be in the Hall of Fame. But then again, I don't watch as much NFL as you guys do.
I mean, if I want a different sport, but if we want to talk Hall of Fame and telling the story, baseball, who just announced their 3 Hall of Famers for this class. But
don't even get me started on the baseball Hall of Fame.
The guys that you have to mention when telling the story of baseball aren't in the Hall of Fame. So
I can't remember what
Barry Bonds. Yeah,
I can't remember what your guys' take on Barry Bonds is. The fact that he is not in the Hall of Fame is offensive to me.
He should be in.
Yeah, I think we're all.
I'm a Giants fan, but he should be in.
Like more, and I'm an Angels fan. Like BYU, the Angels beat Barry Bonds for a World Series title. Like my people are the reason that Barry Bonds does not have a World Series ring. And I'm still saying that Barry Bonds is the best baseball player probably ever. Well,
you're saying that because you beat him. If he was the reason your guys had 0 rings, you would be like, this guy is the worst. Get him out.
Hey, man, BYU's beaten Utah every opportunity since 2019. You don't see me caping for any Utah football players except for the ones that transferred to BYU.
this whole conversation deserves a pretty big asterisk in the sense that we are not discussing who the better player is. And like with your point about Tyrann Mathieu and what other people have also said about Taysom Hill as a football player, I wholeheartedly agree with. Like if we are comparing who is the better player, Vaisa Gahema, Chad Lewis, Bart Oates, or Taysom Hill, the answer I think is unequivocally Taysom Hill. If we're comparing just talent. But if we are comparing who had the better NFL career, which is where this whole thing started, because like, again, I don't think that, Kyle Van Noy is the second best BYU player to ever play in the NFL. What I'm saying is that he had the second best career in terms of he was a starter on multiple Super Bowl teams. I think he went to 3 Super Bowls with the New England Patriots. They won 2 of them. And he was not only just a starter, but him and Dante Hightower were like the heartbeats of that Patriots defense. He now, has been a starter at multiple places. He was a starter with New England. He was a starter with the Chargers. He was a starter now for the past couple of years with the Baltimore Ravens. He's putting up 12.5 sacks in a season in like his 11th or 12th year in the NFL. Like his career is better than a lot of other guys who are probably better actual players. And so to take it back to Taysom Hill, like, yes, Taysom Hill, better football player, would probably select him on my football team before I selected Vaisa Gahema. However, Vaisa Gahema was an all-pro, multi-year starter, like the best player at his position in the NFL. Taysom Hill has not been any of those things. He's been really freaking good and really fun to watch. And Joe hates it when I say this, but he is great in his role as a gadget-type player where it's 4th and short, we need a yard.
He's Taysom more Hill than that, Hunter!
As a quarterback. We are running a 2 tight end package, put Foster Moreau in there. He's our starting tight end. Taysom Hill's our second guy. If we want to run, him and Alvin Kamara in the backfield together, like he can do all those things. He can play punt coverage. He can play, punt team, whatever. Like he can do all those things, but he's also like a 0-year starter. I know he started games at quarterback because of injury, but like he has never been the predominant starter at his position in the NFL. And for me, like it's hard to be like a guy who's never been a starter at his position at any of the 3 positions that he could play has never been this predominant starter. Like he's been beaten out by Foster Moreau for the starting tight end position. And again, like I love Taysom Hill, but like that's just the reality. And if he was good enough to be the full-time starter at tight end, he would be, because that's how the NFL operates. So it's hard for me to be like, yes, a guy who is not as good as Foster Moreau in terms of being the NFL starting tight end, that guy's had a better career than Chad Lewis, who was like a 5-time Pro Bowler, started multiple games for the Eagles, went to the Super Bowl with the Eagles, all these things.
Which is a take I need to repent of, by the way. Like, again, that was said in the heat of battle. I repent of my take.
Fog of war got to Joe on that one.
Was a better tight end than Chad Lewis, even though Taysom Hill has scored more touchdowns than Chad Lewis.
Okay, anyway. So here's my one thought, because to be honest, when you two, and I say get going, like it's like this, it's not like some knockdown drag out fight. It does feel like a Clash of the Titans sometimes, but in like the best way possible. Here's my one
Stephen A. Skip.
Yeah. Here's
I don't want to know who I am in that.
here's my one thought. I don't even know, because I've seen both sides. I think that's one of the best things about being friends with you guys is I get to see both sides. I get to understand both sides because they're explained at length. I might get death threats from Johnny Linehan for this take. I just have a hard time with Lee Johnson being on there. Vaisa Gahema can absolutely stay. That one makes sense to me. I hear the 18 seasons. I think contextually being a starting punter, and I don't want to like simplify the punter position too much, but like in the NFL, as long as you like don't suck, teams aren't like wasting a pick to try and replace you, right? Like as long as you can still kick the football and kick the football well, you kind of have the job until you're done. And so for me, Lee Johnson was a weapon from the standpoint of like field position. And the point of field position is to give your team a better opportunity to score points, to score touchdowns. Whereas like Taysom Hill is really good at that thing that ultimately you're trying to do in the NFL, and that's just score more points than the other team. He can score from anywhere. He's good on fourth and short, like that was acknowledged earlier, but he's hit 50-yard runs against like the Falcons, against a bunch of teams in his division. He's been really, really good at that. The other thing I have a little bit of an issue with is I feel like the starts, like Oates, for example, is a great example of like what good being a starter for multiple years like is like a good thing. 12 seasons, started every year, like that's an accomplishment. But I think there's a little too much weight being put on it because you also look at like Zach Wilson. Like Zach Wilson has more starts than Taysom Hill. One of them has a better career than the other and doesn't have any starts at that position. And I think that to me, there's a little too much weight on starting in the NFL, and there's not enough weight being put into producing in the NFL. And I think that to me is where ultimately I would take Lee Johnson out and put Taysom Hill in. But that's
I get that argument in the sense of Zach Wilson versus Taysom Hill because you're comparing 2 years as the starter to what Taysom Hill has done. But when you're Lee Johnson or you're Bart Oates and you're starting for a decade plus consecutively, and with Lee Johnson, it was like 16, 17 years. Like that's different because that means you are producing. And we don't have the offensive lineman stats. We don't necessarily have like the punter stats, although he punted over 12,000 times in his career for 52,000 yards. So we could do some math on what.
Was Lee Johnson a bad offense merchant?
Maybe. He did play for the Bengals for 11 years. But I think that was when the Bengals were good and going to Super Bowls. But like in the context that you brought it up, Trevor, yes, like discount the stats argument. But when you're talking about positions where like we can quantify, like Taysom's production was X, like he scored this many touchdowns, he rushed for this many yards. But the guys like Bart Oates and Lee Johnson, it's not as apples to apples. So I think looking at, well, clearly he was producing at a high level. Clearly he was valued highly by both the team he was on and the other teams in the NFL because he started so many games over a long stretch of time. Like it's hard to be like punts are worth this much and touchdowns are worth this much in the sense of this argument, but I think it's a little bit different when you're talking about how long of a period those starts stretched for.
Football is the hardest sport to pick, like who is the greatest player. Like obviously Tom Brady is the answer, but like after Tom Brady, who is the second greatest player in the history of the NFL? Because like it's so hard to compare. That disqualifies your first take right there. This is an off-season pod, but like it's just so hard to compare positions. Like Taysom Hill plays a different position than Lee Johnson.
Taysom Hill plays 4 different positions than Lee Johnson.
Yeah, like you could argue that Taysom Hill could also be an NFL punter because that's what he was in high school. But the last thing I'll say about this, because we have to move on to basketball because we also have a basketball team. The point about Vi Sikahema and Lee Johnson, they're specialists, right? Like Vi Sikahema was a specialist, was an all-pro specialist.
Mm-hmm.
So if he gets credit for being a specialist, why can't Taysom Hill get credit for being an equally great generalist? Just because they don't have an all-pro position for whatever the heck position Taysom Hill plays, because he's the only one in the NFL who actually does what he does. And frankly, I think he's the only player in the NFL who can do what he does, because if there was someone else who could do what he does, there'd be other guys like him.
That's fair. But for that same reasoning, I would go to Vi because, again, Vi was the best player at his position. Not just on his team, but in the entirety of the NFL. Taysom Hill has not been that. He's been the best like generalist or gadget guy, but he has never been the best. He's not the best tight end on the team. He's never been the best tight end on the team. He's not the best running back. That's been Alvin Kamara. He's not the best quarterback. That's been Drew Brees and Derek Carr and Spencer Rattler. And in a league, again, like the famous quote from the GM, where it's like, if who's the guy, Hannibal Lecter, like ran a 4.40, we'd say he had an eating disorder. Like that's the league that Taysom Hill is playing in, where they will find any excuse. Like I witnessed Kareem Hunt scoring touchdowns for the Kansas City Chiefs this week. A guy with his past. I've seen Rashee Rice started the year on the Kansas City Chiefs. Seems like there's a trend here. A guy who caused a massive pileup on the freeway with drugs and guns in the trunk of his car, allegedly, and then fled the scene. And I don't need to know if I need to say allegedly there because I'm pretty sure there's video, but I'll say there's allegedly. Like not a single suspension, was welcomed back into the facility with open arms the very next morning, like all those things. Like this is a league where if you are good at your position and good enough, like they will excuse anything. So it's hard for me to like imagine that like, oh, well, they're saving Taysom Hill to be this gadget guy and that's why he's not starting at tight end. Like, no, if he was the best player, he'd be playing every single snap at that position that he's the best at. He just simply hasn't been. So it's hard for me, like, even though, yes, like Vi was a specialist, he at least was like the very best punt returner on his team and best punt returner, not just and kick returner, not just on his team, but in the entirety of the NFL. So for me, it's like, if in a vacuum, I didn't tell you names and I didn't tell you stats or anything like that. And I said, one guy had a career like this. He was a perennial backup. Like he was really fun to watch, very talented, was never the starter at his position, or this guy who was a primary starter, shorter period of time, I think he was like 5 years, but was an all-pro, like in a vacuum, blind resume, like that to me is the better career. Like I'd rather be a multi-time starter, a all-pro, or in the case of some of these other guys, a Super Bowl champion as a starter, like all these things, than like, yes, Taysom Hill has great numbers, but again, if we're just talking careers and not just talent, then I would say I would take some of those other guys' careers.
There's one thing we haven't considered, and that is looks, and in which case I would 100% rather be Taysom Hill. But there is
on our elder Sikahema of the 70.
No, I'm comparing.
I don't know.
Not Vi to Taysom. But there is a simple solution here. We just simply create an all-pro position for gimmick guy. And I will head that up, because as the resident gimmick guy on the podcast, that is something I can advocate for. Second thing
that could
is
be a next year's Hypie Award.
Given recent events, can we expect to see Kareem Hunt and Rashee Rice courtside at a BYU basketball game next year, if this is the pattern?
Kareem Hunt, maybe, if we're the pattern. I don't know Rashee Rice's domestic history. But I don't know.
We don't have to unpack that. If you know, you know.
Can we say this though? Can we say this? The virtue signaling that has happened on Twitter, that it was as if BYU opened the doors to him, which he was not there as a BYU guest. BYU did not say come to the basketball game. The seats that he was in were purchased, probably not by him, but his partners that he was there with. He was not there as a guest of BYU. He was there as someone else's guest. The way that and we know what fans it is.
And he was never even on, he was never on the Jumbotron. BYU shows everyone who's famous adjacent on the Jumbotron. Hey, remember Kyle Collinsworth and Travis Hansen, I'm pretty sure, were on the Jumbotron yesterday. Conor McGregor was nowhere to be found.
This person has 4,000 TikTok followers. Check them out on the Jumbotron. This person was in the background of an episode of Home Improvement. They will tout whoever they can to get them credibility. They did not do that with Conor McGregor, but the reaction is as if BYU brought him in, sat him at center court, and put him on the video Jumbotron with a banner that said he's innocent. That's what they are thinking happened at this BYU basketball game. That they brought him in and they were like, yeah, he's innocent. He's this great guy. That's not at all what happened. It was purely BYU fans being like, this is crazy that the best UFC fighter in the history of the sport is sitting courtside at a BYU game on a Tuesday night. how random and how crazy is that? Like the last person anyone would have expected, pretty wild. And then it was turned into like, wow, I can't believe BYU and their fans would celebrate a guy with this history of different crimes that we won't unpack. But it is
what does that even mean? Of course, BYU fans would celebrate that. Like, what image do people have in their heads of what a BYU fan is that they think like we celebrate sin?
I don't know.
Like, what about our history and tattletale culture makes you think that?
Well,
and they welcomed Harvey Unga back to the team.
Well, and they brought. I've seen some people now that they brought to light, obviously, like, Bucked Up was the reason why he was there, right?
No free ads.
And he was.
Have we mentioned like who we're talking about is Conor McGregor?
Yes.
We've said okay. We did
the notorious, the double champ. Like as soon as like BYU made it like pretty blatantly clear, like, hey, this is not like we weren't going to draw attention to this. Like, as far as we understand, like his security, Conor McGregor's security team was told like, hey, we're not going to give you any sort of special treatment. You're just kind of here. People then begin to latch on with the basketball team taking a picture with him at the end of the game. Like we're not all like chronically online. Like I guarantee if I like walked up to my mom, I love you, Mom, by the way, I know you're listening to this and I appreciate you. And I asked her who Conor McGregor is, she probably has no clue. Like this is just a basketball team that recognizes a famous athlete that's at their game, like just randomly on a Tuesday night, and they took a picture with him. Like it's
the 20-year-old kid was like, "Holy cow, it's Conor McGregor! We should take a picture."
Yeah,
I'm chronically online, and I follow sports obviously very closely. I knew he was a dirtbag, not a good guy.
Yeah,
he's a horrible.
It's not like I was familiar with the court proceedings.
He's an insane athlete, though. Like it's just
I'll do you one better. My dad does know who Conor McGregor is, and when I told him he was at the BYU game, my dad was like, "Well, I guess I'm buying my first case of Bucked Up." Like most people who know who Conor McGregor is, which this is another interesting argument, is he the most famous person internationally to ever enter the Marriott Center, which I think there is a strong argument. The answer is yes. Most of the people, which I mean, they're famous for us, but some person in
the most famous worldly person, Hunter. Come on now, keep with us here.
Like that's the most important person to ever enter the Marriott Center. However, most people, the lonely god, most people who know Conor McGregor's name don't know anything about his history, and that's really all we got to say about it. Like, Hunter, you nailed it right on the head. Like, it was just, oh, cool. A world famous athlete is here. What is he doing here on a Tuesday night? That's so random. Drake once wore a, he once wore
the Holiday Bowl jersey.
Yeah.
He once wore a Holiday Bowl jersey, and you don't see me going and calling Tim Ballard about it. If you know on that one too.
Jimmy Butler wore Jordan Russell jersey.
Yeah, so it's
Jimmy Butler also in the news recently. Obviously, not for anything as bad as what's going on, but maybe kind of not a jerk.
Just get used to it. Like, AJ DeBance is coming next year. There's going to be some high-profile people that are probably going to come to BYU basketball games, and not all of them are going to be people that you like. So, just enjoy the randomness of it.
If we get Taylor Swift, it will be someone I don't like.
hearing Conor McGregor starts chant in front of the BYU student section who is holding a sign about beer. That is a Mad Lib that of course Barstool is going to pick that up. Okay, let's talk about the actual basketball, because we're 30 minutes in, and so far we've discussed nothing of what our actual listeners want us to discuss, but that's the Hype Train Pod for you. Where do we even start? BYU picks up their first signature win of the Kevin Young era of the season, first quad one win. And just like that, BYU is right back in tournament contention. They were like on the consideration line of Joe Lunardi's bracketology. They are now the third team out. of the tournament after just one game, and they'll be playing the last team in on Saturday in UCF. Let's talk about the macro of it before we get into specifics, but what does this win mean for BYU?
It means the season's not dead. Like, I think you lose this game and it's like, okay, now barring upset wins over Houston, Kansas, Iowa State, and then a run in the tournament, BYU is out. I think this keeps them alive, and I think essentially turns this Saturday's game against UCF into a quasi playoff game, tournament game. Like, obviously other things can happen, but it feels like this game, when the season's over, you're going to be splitting hairs between teams like BYU and UCF, and a head-to-head win over the other one does a lot for you in terms of we should get in over them.
Which I agree with. Like, I think in terms of momentum, this is a really important game. In terms of like the overall tournament resume, like 7 of BYU's next 8 games are quad 1 games. And I think realistically, you probably need 3 or 4 quad 1 wins to feel comfortable, and avoiding any bad losses. Like losing at home to Kansas State would be a disaster. But really, looking at BYU's schedule coming up, like UCF is one of the more gettable games on that schedule. And if you need 3 or 4 quad 1 wins, this UCF one feels like one of those you have to get. But starting with the Baylor game, like that was just a heck of a basketball game. Like that was really fun, really entertaining, really fun to be a part of, really cool to be a part of that atmosphere. Seeing guys like, future NBA players like Cannon Catchings, like Jaeger Demon, like VJ Edgecombe for Baylor, just trading blows back and forth. Like that was legitimately some of the best basketball I've ever seen in the Marriott Center. And I've watched a second ranked Gonzaga team come in to this building. I've watched an Iowa State team last year that was top 10 for most of the season coming to this building. And that was legitimately some of the best basketball I think BYU has ever played.
Yeah, it was to go back to your original question. I think at least in my mind, if you guys disagree, let me know. But I think to me, yesterday confirmed what I believe to be the biggest issue with this team, which was not, scheme. It wasn't the players not panning out. It was just the fact that you've got a new coach with new players in a new system, just trying to sort it all out. And for the longest time, it was just, once this team gels, they're going to be pretty good. And I think we've seen that not even just last night, but the last 3 games, because, oh, by the way, they've won 3 straight Big 12 games for the first time ever. Didn't even do that last season. And we thought that team was phenomenal, and they were. The Kevin Young project can work. Don't even get me started on that video you sent me with that guy saying he was out on Kevin Young. I don't know how you could possibly say that after a win. It's got to be the dumbest. We'll address that. It's got to be the dumbest time to take that stance on that hill, but I digress. This is a team, and if you watch the cut, if you follow BYU on Twitter, Kevin Young has been talking about the importance of stacking wins and maintaining momentum. Obviously, Joe, as you said earlier, and momentum is not built by a team that just doesn't have enough talent, or has a scheme that doesn't work, or a coach that isn't up to snuff. This is a team that just needed to kind of get the ball rolling and figure out how each and every player's strengths and weaknesses and how they fit within the offense. This team just looks like a well-oiled machine by comparison to how they've looked months and weeks previous to this one. I think the ball movement's gotten a lot better. The defense has been great just in general. I feel like they've been pretty assignment sound when they go to zone. The man defense has been good. The help side defense has been good. The ball's moving with a lot more purpose. They're not just passing the ball around the arc for really no reason, standing around. There's ball movement. There's people cutting. The plays are made on time, and people are taking smart shots. I think we'll talk about him more specifically later, Joe, but you brought up Cannon Catchington, his shot selection yesterday. I think everybody's gotten a little bit better at that. They know where they're supposed to score. Dawson Baker has figured out how to hit a floater and has just gone to that well over and over and over again. This team is just finding a way to gel within itself. And I think when talent meets chemistry, you get a win streak like this, and you go into a game against UCF feeling confident, even though they just took Kansas to the wire. And it's a team where if you continue to stack the wins, as Coach Young is talking about, this is a team that could be in the tournament fairly easily by the end of February, despite how tough that schedule is.
The team has the talent. Like I that was kind of my biggest takeaway is like, this was the first, that was Baylor at their best. Baylor's had their struggles this year. They've been dealing with some injuries. They've been dealing with some depth issues. They're missing two. They were missing two of their better guys. But they had won 65 straight games coming in which they shot over 50% from the floor, and that streak ended on Tuesday. Like that was Baylor's best shot. That was a team that has been in the top 25, is a top 25 team in KenPom, and has been all season long. Like, you took their best shot, and for the first time this season, you punched back. Like that was a game that BYU had lost 4 or 5 times already this season. They had a 8 to 10 point lead most of that game against Texas Tech. They had a 10-point lead against Ole Miss. They had large leads against teams like Utah and TCU. Like those were very winnable games that BYU managed to kind of choke away in the final 5 minutes, and they didn't do that. They tried their darndest in regulation, but when they came out, and like once it went to overtime, I thought it was over. Like I thought BYU was, they lost the momentum. And then immediately you get Richie Saunders doing Richie Saunders things in overtime, and Dallin Hall hitting a huge three. Like that was a game that BYU loses earlier this season. And I think it shows that this team is starting to turn a corner. They've won 4 out of their last 5. They have a 3-game winning streak in conference play for the first time in the Big 12 era. Like, this is the team. Like there's a squad in there somewhere, right? Like we've been saying this we said this last week, like there's a good team in there. They just needed time. And last night it just kind of felt like it all came together. Which again, if Cannon Catchings is going to give you 23 points on 8 shots, and like, it's hard to imagine that you were ever going to lose that game.
They tried their best to choke it away at the end, and we can get into the last few minutes and kind of thoughts on it. But probably from tip to final whistle at the end of overtime, BYU's most complete game.
Yeah.
Like, obviously there were better games when they were playing worse teams, but I think just from a overall game perspective, like, I'm having trouble thinking of one game where it's like, yes, for the entire stretch. Like, they had their scoring droughts, which it seems like they do every single game, but for the first time it lasted 3 minutes instead of like 6 minutes. So, I mean,
yeah,
Yegor looked good. Obviously, Cannon Catchings has had his best game of his career. First player in this century to like not miss go 8 for 8 from the field, and not miss a 3 and not miss a free throw. First freshman this century. Also first freshman this century to do all those things and then be benched for the final 4 minutes and overtime.
So let's get into that. Like, you made the point earlier today, Hunter, and I think it's a valid one. And it's the one that for any of you guys who listen to Sleepers Media, they've been national podcasts, but they've been beating the BYU drum all off season ever since Kevin Young was hired. They were landing all these huge recruits. The lead guy on that show seems to be out on Kevin Young, which I think is a little bit over and overreaction, and also directly contradicts what he said like 2 episodes ago after the Cincinnati game, when he talked about what a great coach Kevin Young was for changing the way that he's handled Jaeger Demon. So there's some inconsistency there for sure. But the larger point that he's making is that you're getting a legacy game from Cannon Catchings. He's 8 for 8. He's got 23 points. He's going like he's been by far your best offensive guy. I don't know anything about. I don't watch him every play when he's on defense. Maybe there's something I don't understand there. But in a time where Baylor is making all their shots anyway, and you can't get a stop anyway with your best defensive guys out there, you would think that having a guy who literally cannot miss would be valuable to have over the last 8 minutes of a tight game like that. And so I don't like, I'm sitting there, like everyone in the building is thinking in those final couple minutes, like, where is Catchings? Where is Catchings? And if you're the only one in the gym who is not asking that question, you better hope that you are smarter than everybody in that gym, which I'm sure Kevin Young is. BYU ended up winning the game, but I just can't fathom not playing him when he is playing that well. Like, it just seems like a really easy way to kill the kid's confidence.
Yeah. To your point, because I don't know if I am completely on board with BYU trying to hand the game away at the end outside of not playing Catchings. VJ Edgecombe was listed as like the number 4 guy off the draft board in this upcoming draft. Wright, what was his first name? Robert Wright III, like, is another dude that's probably going to go like top 15 as well. Like, they've got essentially 2 Jaeger Demons, but they also
they're
happen to be
both 5-star kids, like both,
and they're ranked
players.
higher than he is, and we know how good Jaeger's been over the last couple of weeks. Like, them turning it on, I don't know is necessarily entirely on BYU. Like, there was some great defense being played, and their shot
making was insane.
It didn't matter. Like, it was
the Padilla show. Like, don't get me started on the Padilla show.
Yeah, that was tough too. But when in this instance, like you're talking about, it feels like it's best to fight fire with fire, and our flamethrower was sitting on the bench, and like that does feel a little weird. And then not to see him at all in overtime is definitely a decision as well. Obviously, it paid off. I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly what he was thinking. Cannon seemed to be fine with it after the game. How he actually thinks about it is, up entirely to him, I suppose. But definitely a strange decision to take your most proficient scorer, especially in that game, like your most lethal scorer, and sit him for the last, what was it, like 8-10 minutes of like actual basketball time. I don't know. It's pretty crazy.
I've heard 4 arguments as to why, and I'm not going to lie, it's 0 for 4 in terms of making sense to me.
The anti-catchings.
I will dismiss the silliest ones first. First one was free throws. Like, Cannon Catchings, yes, admittedly, I think is shooting 54% from the free throw line. So there was the notion that he was taken off the court for the final 3:44 because they were like, well, they didn't want him to be the one to go to the line in the case of intentional fouling and not great free throw shooters on the line, which makes 0 sense as to why he wouldn't have been in for overtime. Like, that tracks maybe if you're talking about the last couple minutes of the half or of the game, but that does not make sense for overtime because you're obviously not going to start the overtime period by intentionally fouling and sending a guy to the free throw line. So it doesn't make sense there. The second one I heard was like, oh, well, like they weren't confident that he would continue at that pace, which, like, yeah, probably wasn't going to continue to go 8 for 8 from the field if he kept shooting in those final 3:44 and overtime. But I would want to actually see that happen before I preemptively pulled him out. The third one is the one that seems like the most prevailing, which is the defense argument, which, yes, Cannon Catchings from a statistical box score perspective is not your best defender. He, I think, has the 3rd worst defensive box plus minus of anyone on the team. He's also a 6'9" lanky forward who even the announcers were saying like, hey, at the NBA level, this guy projects as a 3-and-D type player. Think like Mikal Bridges. So, and to Joe's point, like they were making shots anyway. So don't you want to have kind of a lankier, bigger guy, especially when you're just trying to guard the perimeter late in the game? And another counter to that is the BYU defense was worse in the last 4 minutes of the game once Cannon Catchings came off the court, as opposed to the prior 4 minutes, his last 4 minutes on the court. Baylor made more shots, they made more free throws, they scored more points in the final 4 minutes as opposed to the 8 to 4 minute mark. So if their point was to take him off the court because they thought that they could get better defensive guys on the court, it had the opposite effect because Baylor actually went on a better run and obviously closed the lead and tied the game at the end of regulation. And the fourth one, which like I guess makes sense because there's not a way to discredit it, but it's they wanted veteran players on the court in the late game situation, to which my retort is, I don't care how long you've been in the program, play your best players at the end of games. And at the end of last game, Cannon was your best player all night. So he should have been on the floor. Like, I don't get the notion of like, I'm going to take my best player, the guy who's hot, the hot hand, I'm going to take him off the court because he's a freshman and I have a junior sitting on the bench. Like, it's the same thing going back to like the Tanner Mangum, Zach Wilson quarterback competition. It's like, well, you just got to start the guy who's a senior as opposed to the freshman. And it's even though the freshman was clearly better. So like, yes, that can be the argument and that could have been the reasoning. It doesn't mean it was good reasoning. Ultimately, BYU ended up winning the game. So it's like a moot point to begin with. And I know BYU fans are going to be upset that we spent any time talking about it. But it is, I think, a fair question to ask of like, yes, BYU got the win, but they also blew a lead in the final couple of minutes, and your best player all night who hadn't missed and was the first freshman in this century to do something, going back to Taysom Hill stats, like he was on the bench. He sat on the bench aside from 4 seconds when it was just a half-court heave just to try to win the game in regulation. And I can't really grasp why that was, aside from the only thing that makes sense to me is just like a lack of trust from Kevin Young towards Cannon Catchings, where it's like, hey, crunch time, I don't necessarily trust this guy. Let's get him out.
Well, I think that's obvious. Like the one, like Kevin Young's reasoning after the game when he was asked about it directly, was their focus was getting stops. Like their focus was defense, and Kevin Young straight out said like that's not Cannon's strong suit right now, and so we went with the experience, which assuming he means Mawot Mag, which is fine. Like Mawot Mag is your best defender. He's last year he was one of the best defenders in the country. Like if you need someone to stop VJ Edgecombe, and no one could stop VJ Edgecombe on that night, mostly because BYU insisted on going under on screens the entire night. Like I'm fine that you can say that it's Cannon is a casualty of playing the same position as your best defender in a game where defense is at a premium. The counter to that is we've seen Cannon and Mawot on the floor together before. And like, it's not like
positions are meaninless in today's basketball world. They can both play.
It's not like Cannon is like an awful on-ball defender. Like maybe he just gets lost on switches, and that's part of the issue. But he's second on the team in blocks. He's fourth on the team in steals. Like that, those aren't in terms of the defensive stats we can actually track. He's not a bad defender. So I don't know. It's tough.
He's still a positive box. I said he was a third worst defensive box plus minus on the team. He's still a positive one though. Like he's still a plus defender from an analytical, standpoint. There's also no quicker way.
So the question becomes like, at the end of the game is one thing when you're like when you have a lead. Like when you have a lead, the goal is defense. Like if BYU is trailing in the final 5 minutes of that game, I think unequivocally Cannon is on the floor, but I think they just kind of went into prevent defense mode and decided to play their best defensive guys, which again didn't work as Hunter pointed out in the stats. But the question is like, who is the guy that you take off the floor? Because he's not playing over Yegor. He's not playing over Richie. He's not playing obviously over Mawa, and he doesn't play the same position as Keita. So really the only guy who you'd have to take off the floor is Dallin, which I candidly think Dallin is kind of a defensive liability.
That's the other thing, is if you're taking Cannon off, you take
for the
Dallin
most
off.
part. Did I lose you guys?
You're back now. It's just like there's a couple of things that are like hypocritical from the defensive side. Is like, one, yeah, you left Dallin on, but you took him off. Now, if you want to be like, well, Dallin's a better free throw shooter, and we wanted 2 ball handlers, like I get that. But if you want to,
the argument for Dallin is Dallin hit the 3 in overtime. Like if you want Cannon to be a shot maker in overtime, Dallin was that for you. And he hit the buzzer beat, like he hit the buzzer beater that did not beat the buzzer. But like if what you're looking for is offense, like BYU was scoring, like BYU scored in overtime fine. Like Richie was Richie in that scenario. Like if anything, I think the weak link was probably Yegor in OT.
Yeah, it's like, and you probably don't go to overtime, and Dallin doesn't have to hit that shot if you leave Cannon in the game. The last thing I'll say, there's no quicker way to make every defensive stop a crucial defensive stop than by refusing to score points and get buckets in the final minutes. And that's exactly what BYU did. Like, yeah, you look and say, well, we wanted our best defenders on the court. And it's like, well, you wouldn't have needed this, all your best defenders and to get a stop every single time down the court if you were scoring points on the offensive end. And instead they traded, maybe a better defender, which again, the stats prove otherwise because they scored more points with him off the court than with Cannon on. They traded the defensive stops for, in essence, like turnovers and rushed shots at the end of a shot clock on the offensive side of the ball. So you wouldn't have needed as tight of a defense if you were scoring when you had the ball. And they stopped doing that once Cannon came off the court. They didn't score for the final 2 minutes of regulation. They didn't score for the final 3 minutes and no points, I think, in the final 2 minutes, no field goals made in the final 3 minutes of overtime. So it's like you needed guys who could make shots, and the guy who was making shots for you all night was on the bench. Ultimately, again, like, doesn't matter, BYU won the game. But it is just, I think, something that was interesting and something that hopefully, as BYU takes on these, the stretch of these next 8 games against some of the toughest teams in the country, that like stuff like this kind of gets dialed in. Players find their role, are able to settle in. KY can get his rotations down, and they find ways to win the game, which, like, they did pull it out. But again, I would have preferred not to have to go to overtime because they could not score with Cannon catchings off the court there in the final minutes.
And like, to your point about KY, like, Kevin Young's still figuring it out, right?
Yep. Not out on Kevin Young. Put that out there.
I think it's clearly taken him some time to adjust to the college game, and that's kind of the struggle. Is in the NBA, talent is everything. Like, it doesn't matter if it's young talent, old talent. Talent rules all. And at the beginning of the season, he leaned into that young talent. He leaned into Yegor. He leaned into Cannon. Those were the guys that were getting most of the minutes. And as conference play started, like, it's clear that wasn't working. BYU did not beat they were 1-5 against high major opponents until like 2 weeks ago. And at that point, that's when Cannon got moved to the bench. Yegor kind of took on a little bit lesser of a role around that TCU game, around that Oklahoma State game. And so far that's worked. He's clearly realized that in college basketball, experience is king, but now I think we're shifting. It's possible that he shifted a little bit too far in the other direction, where now we're playing Dallin Hall just because he's a third-year player and not because he is your best option to be on the floor. And honestly, I've seen Dallin Hall make plenty of mistakes late in games. Yeah. But like, it's since Cannon's taken on that lesser role, he's improved. He's playing more minutes. His last start was the TCU game. He's played more minutes. It was a season low 7 minutes against Oklahoma State. That number is gradually climbed every game, and he played 25 minutes last night, which was, I think, 1 minute less than Dallin and Yegor played. So like, that's a positive trend. Like, I think we're going to see a lot more Cannon catchings, and I'm glad that we're learning this in a win versus a loss. But the point that we're trying to make here is that BYU just needed time. Like, Kevin Young needed time to figure out who he was. This basketball team needed time to figure out who they were. And I think they're starting to figure some things out, which is evidenced by winning their 4 out of their last 5 and picking up their first quad 1 win.
Real quick, sounds like we might get the Big 12 football schedule in the next day or 2. So that's exciting.
That is exciting.
Lastly, because
by the way, Cannon Catchings is shooting 46% from 3 in conference play.
Not too shabby.
It's pretty good.
Against P5 opponents. So he's kind of the forgive me, Trevin. He's the anti-Trevin.
Or I thought you were gonna say anti-Yegor.
Just like he plays his best basketball against the best teams, and I think that's encouraging. So I think we're going to need a lot more Cannon. So whatever defensive issues that Kevin Young sees with him, hopefully that gets resolved.
All right, we're going to get this next part done in the next 5 minutes because we're on a time crunch, so Trevor can get to his family stuff. But this is the Hypie Award Winners officially presented by Charlie Hustle Co. Clothing. They re-upped, I guess, as a sponsor of the 1012 Network.
Let's go.
For the next few months. So again, head to Charlie Hustle, use the promo code 1012 Network, TEN, the number 1, the number 2, Network, for 15% off any non-sale items. So go get some t-shirts or hoodies or whatever you want for your Valentine out there coming up in a couple of weeks. But this is the Hypie Award Winners. We'll start with Breakout Player of the Year. The nominees were Joe Phillips, Harrison Taggart, Isaiah Glasker, and Tanner Wall. And the winner is friend of the program, friend of the program, Tanner Wall.
Let's go.
Woo! Let's go.
Had I had more time to prepare, I would have gotten an acceptance speech video from Tanner. But next time, maybe we'll do an official awards next time. Yeah. Well, maybe we can get one and put it on social. The winner of the Newcomer Player of the Year. The nominees were Jack Kelly, Mark Collins, Sione Moa, and Tommy Parasis. And the winner is, he's coming back. He's not going to be a newcomer next year, but Jack Kelly.
Let's go.
No surprise there, I don't think. Mark Collins maybe could have given him a run for his money, which I think he did. But Jack Kelly, the winner there. Offensive Player of the Year.
Read off the percentage of the votes if you have that.
I'd have to open up the
okay. Never mind.
Form. I pulled the winners earlier this afternoon and made graphics for them, so I'm reading the graphics.
Okay.
Offensive Player of the Year nominees: LJ Martin, Jake Redsloff, Chase Robertson, Caleb Etienne. The winner is Caleb Etienne.
Let's go.
If we had a most improved player, it would have been a runaway for Caleb Etienne too. Last year, not great. This year, unreal. Offensive Player of the Year.
Let's go. That's sick.
Defensive Player of the Year. Nominees were Jack Kelly, Tyler Batty, who's gotten some good praise from his Senior Bowl week as he prepares for the NFL, Isaiah Glasker, and Jacob Robinson. And the winner is Joe's guy, Isaiah Glasker.
Let's go. That's the right answer.
Good answer. Special Teams Player of the Year. Nominees Will Farron, Parker Kingston, and Keelan Marion. This was the closest one of the bunch. Winner is Will Farron.
Okay.
I mean, you kick a game winner against Utah. I think that's going to score you a couple points, a couple votes.
Game of the Year. Nominees were the game against Oklahoma State, Utah, Kansas State, and Colorado. And the winner for Game of the Year was BYU versus Kansas State.
Nice.
You know what?
I
originally my answer was Colorado. Like I think that was still
Yeah.
the best win of BYU season,
Yep.
but that Kansas State game,
Well,
that
BYU beat Kansas State, who beat
Sorry.
Colorado. So if we're saying best win,
oh
most impressive win, maybe
yeah, sure, whatever.
the best team BYU beat all year was
the
Kansas State.
The Kansas State win was far and away my favorite moment of the season.
Funny you should say that, because the winner for moment of the year nominees: Darius Laster's game winner against Oklahoma State, the game-winning drive versus Utah, big noon kickoff in Provo, and Kingston's punt return touchdown versus Kansas State. This one's going to surprise you. The moment of the year was Darius Laster's game-winning touchdown.
You know what? I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with it too.
I can see that.
I
As
think
a
like
singular
one person
moment?
voted for Big Noon.
It was Joe.
It was not. That was
Joe's
not.
sign being featured on Big Noon. Moment of the year. And finally, the Hypie Heisman. Bigger than the actual Heisman, some say. The nominees were LJ Martin, Jacob Robinson, Isaiah Glasker, and Jack Kelly. And the third winner of the Hypie Heisman Award is Isaiah Glasker.
There you
go. Over the GOAT.
We got a fan base of ball knowers. We really do. I don't have a problem with any of these answers.
We do have one, the most controversial and the final Hypie Award to give out. No shame in saying that this award was bought and paid for. But the recurring guest of the year,
oh man,
goes to Jackson Payne.
Let's go.
We need him and Tanner Wall in the same video, just both giving their acceptance speech. Just side by side.
We'll make it happen. We'll put it on Instagram Reels and maybe TikTok.
You love to see it.
TikTok's not banned, right?
No.
All right, we're back. We'll put it on TikTok too then. Yeah, there's not a single one of those where I was like, oh, I don't know if that would have been my choice. So yes, everyone who voted, give yourselves a pat on the back. Ball knowers, every one of you.
Yes. Awesome season.
Well done.
We actually read off the winners this year, so that's progress, boys. We're making progress.
Did we not do the winners last year?
No. I think we just like completely
because it was a bad year.
Yeah. The best win of the year, the best win of the year was a loss. So
game of the year, BYU losing to Oklahoma.
Shout out, want to give a quick shout out to our fan of the week. My boy Talmadge, who I met at the game last night, came up to me as the game was winding down and just goes like, Joe, awesome to meet you. I love the podcast.
Let's go, Talmadge.
Shout out Talmadge. I was supposed to have been at that game with Joe. So there's no one to corroborate the story.
Yes. Michaela can corroborate, I think. We'll see if she actually goes to bat for me. But we love meeting you guys. Like we're fans just like you. Talmadge was awesome. I'm sad I didn't get to talk to him longer because seems like an awesome guy. But love meeting you guys. Love this community. We're literally just like you guys, just guys being dudes. Talking ball. So appreciate you guys so much. And I love that we're getting recognized for the podcast and not for Twitter anymore. Because this is what we want to grow. So screw X, screw Twitter. It's a trash website anyway. All aboard the Hype Train pod.
Shout out to the Utah Mammoths hockey team too.
Mammoths.